He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just didn't touch them. The line of POW women stood rigid under the Texas sun, heat rising off the dirt like smoke. Every muscle braced for humiliation. Aiko dropped her tin cup. It clattered at his boots. She flinched, waiting for a hand to grab, to strike. Private Ethan Walker paused. 1 second. 2. The whole yard went silent. Instead of reaching for her, he bent down slowly, picked up the cup with his glove, set it on the table, and stepped back a full 3 feet. "You're safe," he said, barely above a whisper. No one moved. The shock wasn't cruelty. It was restraint. The strongest man in the yard was the one who didn't move. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned. It shifted. It became something the women did not recognize. The line held steady under the Texas sky, but the tension that had locked every shoulder in place began to loosen by a fraction. Aiko felt it first in her hands. Her fingers, which had curled inward without her noticing, slowly straightened at her sides. No one had stepped forward to correct them. No one had barked an order. The yard remained governed by rules, but the air no longer felt sharp. Private Ethan Walker checked the names on his clipboard, his voice even as he called them out one by one. Each woman stepped forward when spoken to, stopped at the marked line 3 feet away, answered softly, and stepped back. He did not shorten the distance. He did not extend a hand. When identification tags were returned, he placed them on the edge of the table instead of pressing them into waiting palms. It was a small adjustment. It was not written in any manual, yet it carried weight. Aiko stepped forward when her name was called. The sun caught the edge of the wire fence behind him, a bright line against the open field beyond. She could see acres of dry grass stretching toward a low horizon, nothing like the narrow streets she once knew. Ethan glanced at the paper, then at her, then lowered his gaze just enough to remove scrutiny without surrendering authority. "Tanaka, Aiko," he read carefully, shaping each syllable with respect. The pronunciation was imperfect, but the effort was visible. She nodded once. Her voice did not fail her. "Yes." The words sounded smaller than she intended. He set her identification tag down on the table and stepped back again, creating space before she moved. For a moment, neither of them reached for it. Then she stepped forward, took it, and returned to the line. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No raised voices. No spectacle. Yet the women felt the difference. Across the yard, a canteen of water was set beside the table. Ethan unscrewed the lid, took a brief drink, then placed it down within sight, but not within reach. An unspoken invitation. One of the younger women hesitated before stepping forward. She looked at the canteen, then at him. He shifted slightly to the side, clearing the path without a word. She walked to the table, poured water into her own cup, and stepped back. No one hurried her. Aiko watched this exchange carefully. She had prepared herself for many possibilities, but not this one. Authority without intrusion. Control without humiliation. The wind moved lightly across the yard, lifting dust in thin spirals. Ethan closed his clipboard when the roll call was complete. "Dismissed," he said simply. The women did not scatter. They moved in measured steps back toward their barracks. Aiko glanced once over her shoulder. He was still standing there, hat in place, posture steady, not watching them leave as if claiming victory. He had done nothing extraordinary. He had only chosen not to cross a line. And in that choice, something unfamiliar began to grow, quiet and firm, like the first hint of shade in an open field. That night, the heat did not fade quickly. It lingered in the wooden walls of the barracks, in the thin mattresses, in the air that moved slowly through the screened windows. Aiko lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling where faint lines of moonlight slipped through the slats. Around her, the other women shifted quietly, the sounds small and human. No one spoke about the yard. No one needed to. The absence of something had been louder than any command. She replayed the moment in her mind with careful precision. The tin cup falling. The pause. The measured distance of 3 feet. In another place, under different circumstances, that space might have meant nothing. Here, it had meant everything. She had grown used to bracing herself, to calculating the smallest movement as a potential threat. But today, there had been no sudden reach, no sharp correction, only restraint. The word felt unfamiliar. Across the compound, a single porch light burned outside the administration building, casting a pale circle on the ground. Private Ethan Walker sat on the wooden steps, hat resting beside him, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. A canteen stood near his boot. He stared out toward the fence line, where the dark field stretched for miles beyond camp boundaries. From a distance, the wire seemed less like a barrier and more like a line drawn between worlds. He thought about the way the women had stood that afternoon, rigid under the sun. He had seen that posture before in young recruits who expected humiliation on their first day of training. He had learned something from his father long before the war, on a wheat farm where discipline meant structure, not shame. You do not need to break a person to lead them. You only need to stand steady. Inside the barracks, Aiko turned onto her side. The room smelled faintly of soap and dry wood. She listened to the low breathing around her and realized something had shifted within herself, subtle but undeniable. She had prepared for survival through endurance. She had not prepared for dignity returned in inches. The next morning came with a pale orange sky stretching wide over Texas. The roll call bell rang at 6 sharp. The women stepped into formation again, boots aligned, shoulders squared. Aiko noticed the difference this time. The tension was still present, but it no longer pressed down with the same weight. Ethan walked into the yard as before, clipboard under his arm. He stopped at the same measured distance. Routine had resumed, yet something had settled between them, quiet and firm. When the wind lifted a strand of hair across Aiko's face, she did not flinch. She brushed it back herself. He called names. Voices answered. The space remained intact. Authority did not require intrusion. As the sun climbed higher, the yard filled with ordinary sounds, boots on dirt, paper turning, a canteen lid twisting open. Nothing dramatic unfolded. And yet, in that ordinary rhythm, trust began to take root, not in declarations, not in promises, but in the steady choice to hold a line and refuse to cross it. By the third morning, the distance no longer felt accidental. It felt intentional. The Texas sky opened wide above the compound, pale blue stretching beyond the wire fence for miles, uninterrupted by smoke or ruin. A dry wind moved across the yard, carrying the scent of dust and sun-warmed wood. The women stepped into formation at 6 sharp, boots aligning with the faint chalk mark that had nearly vanished. Aiko stood in the second row now. Her posture remained straight, but it was no longer rigid from fear. It was deliberate, chosen. Private Ethan Walker entered the yard with the same measured pace, clipboard under his arm, hat brim steady against the light. Routine had settled over the compound like a quiet agreement. He stopped at the same 6-foot mark, neither closer nor farther. The space between them had become its own kind of language. Roll call proceeded as it had the previous days. Names spoken clearly, voices answering, paper turning, boots shifting against dirt. When a light gust of wind sent loose pages fluttering from the edge of the supply table, one sheet drifted toward the line. It slid across the ground and came to rest near Aiko's feet. For a moment, no one moved. The old reflex lingered in the air. She looked down at the page. Then she looked up. Ethan met her gaze briefly, not as a challenge, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. He did not step forward. He did not reach. He simply waited. The choice belonged to her. Aiko bent at the waist, picked up the paper, and walked the measured distance to the table. She placed it neatly beside the clipboard. 3 feet separated them. She stepped back before he did. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. Yet it altered the rhythm of the yard. Trust, once imagined as something dramatic, had revealed itself as something quieter. It grew in inches. It formed in pauses. Ethan gave a single nod, almost imperceptible, and continued reading names. No praise, no comment, just continuity. Across the compound, a group of male prisoners moved lumber under supervision, their voices low and distant. Beyond them, the open field shimmered in the rising heat. Aiko returned to her place in line and felt the shift settle deeper within her. She had acted without flinching. He had allowed it without intrusion. Authority had not diminished. It had clarified. When dismissal came, the women turned toward their barracks in orderly rows. The sound of boots against dirt carried evenly across the yard. Ethan remained where he was, reviewing his list. He did not watch them with suspicion. He watched them as a farmer watches rows of crops, not to control growth, but to ensure it continues steadily. Aiko paused at the doorway of the barracks and glanced back once. The morning light framed him against the fence line, a solitary figure standing within defined limits. She understood something then that she had not expected to learn here. Strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it stood still. Sometimes it stepped back. And sometimes it chose not to cross a line at all. The afternoon brought a different kind of test. Not louder, just closer. A dry wind swept across the compound after lunch, pushing dust against the barracks walls and rattling the loose screen on the far window. The sky had turned a hard, polished blue, the kind that made distance look sharper than it was. The women were assigned to stack folded uniforms inside the storage shed near the yard. The space was narrow, wooden beams low overhead, sunlight cutting through thin cracks between planks. Aiko carried a small pile of shirts in her arms, fabric warm from the heat. The room smelled of cotton and cedar. Private Ethan Walker stood just outside the open doorway, not inside, not leaning against the frame, simply positioned where he could see without intruding. The rule had never been spoken aloud, yet it remained understood. Space was part of the structure. As Aiko stepped backward to adjust her stack, her heel caught the uneven edge of a floorboard. The shirts slipped from her arms and scattered across the floor. The sound was soft but sudden in the enclosed room. For a fraction of a second, her body reacted before her mind did. She straightened too quickly, pulse rising, waiting for correction. Ethan heard the shift in movement and stepped toward the doorway. He stopped at the threshold. Not inside. Not over the line. "Take your time," he said evenly. The words were not an order. They were permission. Aiko crouched and gathered the shirts one by one. Dust clung lightly to the fabric. She brushed it away with careful strokes. No one hurried her. No one stepped in to take over. The other women continued their folding without turning it into spectacle. The moment passed quietly, as most meaningful ones do. When she stood again, arms full, she met his gaze briefly. There was no embarrassment reflected there, only steadiness. He nodded once and stepped back into the sunlight, restoring the distance as naturally as if it had been drawn on the ground. Later, as the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the yard, the temperature finally eased by a few degrees. The air softened. Roll call approached again. The women assembled in their usual rows. Aiko noticed something different in herself this time. She was no longer bracing. She was standing. Ethan walked into position with the same measured pace. Clipboard. 6 feet. Pause. The routine had become reliable, almost predictable, yet it had not lost its meaning. When he called her name, her voice answered without strain. The sound carried clearly across the yard. A breeze moved between them, lifting the edge of his sleeve. Neither stepped closer. Neither stepped away. The space remained intact, not fragile but chosen. As dismissal came and the line dissolved into quiet movement toward the barracks, Aiko felt the realization settle fully for the first time. Dignity was not restored through grand gestures. It was protected through restraint. And restraint, repeated day after day, had begun to feel stronger than any display of force. By the end of the first week, the distance had become a boundary both of them protected. The Texas evenings cooled more quickly now, the sun sinking behind the flat horizon in a wash of amber and pale violet. Long shadows stretched across the compound, softening the hard lines of fence and barracks. After supper, the women were allowed a short period of quiet time in the yard before lights out. Some walked slow circles along the inner fence. Others sat on the low wooden steps, mending seams or simply watching the sky change colors. Aiko stood near the far corner where the wire met a weathered post, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Beyond the fence, open land rolled outward for miles, uninterrupted by buildings, uninterrupted by smoke. It was the first landscape she had seen in years that did not carry visible damage. Private Ethan Walker made his usual rounds along the perimeter, boots steady against the dirt, posture upright, but unhurried. He kept the same measured distance as always, never stepping closer than necessary, never speaking unless required. When he reached the corner where Aiko stood, he paused, not directly beside her, but a few yards away. The sky above them shifted from orange to deepening blue. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth. "Kansas looks like this," he said finally, voice even, directed not at her, but toward the horizon. The statement hung in the air, simple and unguarded. Aiko turned her head slightly. She did not step closer. "Where I lived," she replied after a pause, "there were mountains." Her words were careful, shaped slowly, but clear. He nodded once, as if placing that image somewhere in his mind. No questions followed. No personal details exchanged. Just two descriptions laid side by side across an invisible line. The quiet did not feel strained. It felt intentional. Somewhere across the yard, another guard laughed at a distant comment, the sound carrying lightly before fading. The women near the steps continued their low conversation, thread moving through fabric in steady rhythms. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat against the last of the sun. "It gets cold here in winter," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Not mountains cold, but enough." Aiko considered this. Seasons had once marked her life in ordinary ways. Festivals, snowfall, the change of leaves. War had blurred those distinctions into one long season of uncertainty. The idea of winter returning as something predictable felt unfamiliar. "I will see," she answered softly. He inclined his head again, acknowledging the response without pressing it further. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried understanding without intimacy, respect without familiarity. After a few moments, he resumed his walk along the fence line, boots pressing shallow prints into the dirt. Aiko remained where she was, watching the last strip of light fade from the horizon. She realized that what had begun as restraint had grown into something steadier. Not friendship, not alliance, simply recognition. Two people standing on opposite sides of circumstance, choosing each day not to reduce the other to an enemy. The boundary remained clear, and because it remained clear, it felt safe. The next morning arrived with a low bank of gray clouds stretching across the Texas sky, muting the usual glare of the sun. The air felt heavier, cooler by a few degrees, as if the land itself were pausing. A fine layer of dust had settled overnight along the fence posts and the wooden rail near the yard. Roll call began at 6 sharp, as it always did. Boots aligned. Names called. Voices answered. The routine had grown steady, almost predictable. Yet something shifted midway through the count. A distant rumble rolled across the flat horizon, soft but persistent. Thunder. The women glanced upward almost in unison. Rain in this region did not arrive gently. It announced itself. Private Ethan Walker looked toward the sky, then back at his list. The wind picked up first, sweeping across the compound in quick gusts that tugged at sleeves and lifted strands of hair. Aiko felt the first cool drop strike her forearm, sharp against the lingering heat from the week before. Another drop followed, then several more. Within seconds, the yard transformed. Dust darkened into damp earth. The chalk line beneath their boots dissolved completely. The women held formation, waiting for instruction. Ethan closed his clipboard and raised his voice just enough to carry across the yard. Inside, steady pace. No urgency. No alarm. Just direction. The women turned in orderly rows toward the barracks as the rain intensified, falling harder now, drumming against the tin roofs. The ground became slick in patches, shallow puddles forming along uneven boards near the storage shed. Aiko stepped carefully, boots sliding slightly against wet wood. Ahead of her, one of the younger women hesitated near a small dip where water had begun to pool. For a brief moment, movement stalled. Ethan stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the puddle. He did not reach out. He did not take hold. Instead, he shifted a loose plank with the toe of his boot, pressing it flat to create a more stable surface. "Watch your step," he said evenly, stepping back again to restore space. The woman crossed safely. Aiko followed, steady and balanced. The rain fell harder now, soaking through thin fabric, clinging to sleeves. Inside the barracks, the women gathered near the windows, watching sheets of water sweep across the yard. The fence beyond blurred into a silver outline against the field. Ethan remained outside a moment longer, ensuring every door was secured before stepping under the narrow overhang near the administration building. His hat darkened under the rain. He removed it briefly, running a hand across his hair, then replaced it with the same composed motion. Through the window, Aiko saw him standing there, not seeking shelter inside their space, not crossing that invisible line even in a storm. The thunder rolled closer, echoing across the flat land in long, low waves. Water streamed from the roof in steady lines. The yard, once rigid and sunbaked, had softened into something fluid and reflective. Aiko realized that boundaries, like the ground beneath them, could hold firm even when the surface changed. The rain would pass. The line would remain. And the choice to respect it would begin again tomorrow. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By late afternoon, the clouds broke apart into long gray ribbons drifting east, and sunlight returned in thin, slanted beams that turned every puddle into a sheet of gold. The yard smelled different now. Wet earth, clean wood. The dust that had once lifted with every step lay settled and quiet. Water clung to the wire fence in small droplets that caught the light before slipping down into the soil. The women were allowed back outside once the ground steadied. Their boots left darker prints in the softened dirt, each step deliberate. Aiko walked slowly across the yard, noticing how the chalk line had completely disappeared beneath the rain. There was no visible mark now separating where they were meant to stand. Yet when roll call began again, the line reformed exactly where it had always been. Memory had replaced chalk. Private Ethan Walker took his place at the usual distance. 6 feet. Not measured by rule, but by repetition. The air felt cooler against his skin. He removed his hat briefly as he read the list, wiping a trace of moisture from the brim before setting it back in place. The ground between him and the women was damp but firm. Aiko noticed how carefully he positioned his boots, not stepping into the space that had become shared but not crossed. When he called her name, her voice carried steady through the clearing air. A breeze moved lightly through the yard, lifting the edges of damp sleeves and drying fabric in slow motion. After roll call, work assignments resumed. Crates were reorganized, laundry lines restrung after sagging under rainwater. Aiko carried folded shirts toward the line, pausing near the table as Ethan marked an inventory sheet. A single button rolled off the stack and dropped near the edge of the space between them. It landed in a shallow puddle, half submerged. For a brief moment, both of them saw it. The water reflected the sky in a thin mirror around the small white circle. Ethan glanced at her, then stepped slightly to the side, clearing the angle without moving forward. The choice rested with her again. Aiko bent down, retrieving the button carefully, wiping it clean against the inside of her sleeve. She stepped forward only to the boundary and placed it on the table. Their hands did not meet. They did not need to. Good catch, he said quietly, almost to himself. The words were light, unforced. She inclined her head once, returning to her place. Nothing in the yard announced what had changed. There were no speeches, no dramatic gestures. The fence still stood. The watchtower remained occupied. The rules were unchanged. And yet the absence of a visible line on the ground did not weaken the boundary. It strengthened it. The rain had washed away the mark, but it had not erased the understanding. As the sun lowered again toward the wide Texas horizon, long shadows stretched across the yard in even bands. Aiko stood in formation at dismissal, boots aligned with a line no one could see, but everyone respected. Ethan closed his clipboard and looked out across the field beyond the fence. The land was open, quiet, endless. Between them lay 6 feet of space, steady and chosen, holding more weight than any chalk line ever could. The ground dried by morning, but the air carried a different weight. News traveled through camps in fragments, in quiet exchanges between guards, in headlines folded under arms. War had a rhythm of its own, distant yet constant. Aiko sensed it in the way the guards spoke a little lower that day, in the way the administration door opened and closed more often than usual. The yard looked the same. The fence stood firm. The horizon stretched wide and unbroken. Yet something unseen pressed against the edges of routine. Roll call began at 6 sharp. Boots aligned along a line no longer marked by chalk. Private Ethan Walker stepped into position, clipboard in hand, posture unchanged. 6 feet. Steady. The distance remained exact, as if measured by memory rather than tape. His voice carried clearly across the yard. As he read each name, Aiko answered when called, her tone level. The exchange held its familiar shape. But after the final name, he did not immediately dismiss them. He closed the clipboard slowly and looked out past the line of women toward the open field beyond the fence. For a moment, the only sound was wind brushing through dry grass. There may be changes soon, he said, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a statement placed carefully in the space between them. No explanation followed. No details offered. The women remained still, absorbing the weight of possibility. Change could mean many things. Aiko felt the word settle in her chest like a small stone dropped into water. She had learned not to build expectations too quickly, yet the air felt different. Not tense. Anticipatory. Work assignments continued as usual. Crates moved. Laundry folded. Inventory checked. The ordinary rhythm of the yard did not falter. But beneath it ran a quieter current. Ethan maintained his measured pace, correcting small errors, marking notes, always restoring the distance after each exchange. Near midday, as Aiko carried a stack of folded uniforms toward the storage table, a gust of wind lifted one shirt from the top. It fluttered briefly before landing near the invisible boundary between them. She stepped forward and retrieved it without hesitation. He did not move closer. He did not retreat. The space held. When she placed the shirt back on the stack, he gave a slight nod. No words. The gesture was enough. In the afternoon, clouds gathered faintly along the horizon, thin and high, casting long streaks of shadow across the field. Aiko found herself glancing beyond the fence more often than before. The world outside felt less abstract now, less distant. Change. The word echoed quietly. As dismissal came and the women turned toward the barracks, Ethan remained standing in the yard, hat brim low against the light. The distance between them had never closed. It had not needed to. Whatever changes were coming, the line they had both chosen to respect had already done its work. It had restored something neither of them had named aloud. And that restoration would not vanish simply because the chalk was gone. The announcement came at dawn, not through shouting, not through urgency. It arrived folded inside a typed memo carried under the arm of the camp commander. The air that morning felt unusually still, as if the wind itself were waiting. The sky stretched pale and wide over West Texas, streaked faintly with early light. Roll call formed at 6 sharp. Boots aligned along the invisible line that memory had drawn in the dirt. Private Ethan Walker stepped forward with his clipboard, posture unchanged, distance measured. 6 feet. Steady. Aiko stood in the second row, hands relaxed at her sides. She had slept lightly, aware that something had been building beneath the routine. After the last name was called, Ethan did not dismiss them. Instead, he stepped back half a pace as the camp commander approached the yard. Paper unfolded. Glasses adjusted. The voice that followed was formal, restrained. The war in the Pacific had shifted. Negotiations were underway. Repatriation procedures would begin in stages. No dates were given. No promises made. Only preparation. The words settled over the yard without sound. No cheers. No visible reaction. Just stillness. Aiko felt the air move through her lungs more slowly than before. Return. The word hovered in her mind, uncertain and distant. The commander finished speaking and turned away. Routine resumed. Yet nothing was entirely the same. Ethan looked down at his clipboard for a moment longer than usual before closing it. When his eyes lifted, they met the line of women with the same steadiness as always. Assignments as posted, he said evenly. Work continued. Crates were lifted. Inventory checked. Laundry folded. The rhythm held, even as the meaning beneath it shifted. Near midday, Aiko carried a stack of neatly pressed shirts toward the storage table. The air felt warmer now, the sun climbing higher across the open sky. As she approached the familiar boundary, she paused. Ethan stood opposite her, marking an entry on his sheet. For a brief second, neither moved. The space between them felt narrower, though it remained the same 6 feet it had always been. She placed the shirts down carefully. He nodded once, quiet acknowledgement. You will go home, he said, not as a command, not as reassurance. A statement. She considered the words. Home had become an abstract shape, something blurred by distance and time. Yes, she answered softly. The exchange required no more. No elaboration. The line held. Later, as the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Aiko stood again in formation at dismissal. The fence beyond them glowed faintly in the evening light. Ethan closed his clipboard and looked out across the field. The land stretched open and unclaimed beyond the wire. They had never crossed the boundary drawn between them. They had never needed to. In the quiet discipline of distance, something had been restored that neither war nor wire could take away. And now, as change approached on steady feet, that restoration would travel with them, carried not in words, but in memory. The first transport list was posted 3 days later. Not all names. Just a column of 20, typed in clean black ink and pinned to the board outside the administration building. The paper moved slightly in the dry morning breeze, held in place by two metal tacks that caught the light. The yard had not changed. The fence still framed the horizon. The watchtower still stood quiet against the sky. Yet the air carried a sharpened clarity, as if every sound now had edges. Aiko read the list from a measured distance. Her name was there, third from the bottom. The letters looked smaller than she expected. Real, but almost fragile. Around her, the other women absorbed the information in silence. Some names were missing. Some would remain longer. No one spoke loudly. There was no celebration. Only the steady intake of breath that comes when something long imagined finally takes shape. Roll call proceeded as usual. Boots aligned. 6 feet. Private Ethan Walker held his clipboard with the same composure he had shown from the beginning. When he called her name, it carried the same tone as every other morning. No emphasis. No change. She answered clearly. After dismissal, the women selected for transport were instructed to report to the supply table for final documentation. Aiko stepped forward with the group, stopping at the familiar boundary. Ethan stood opposite her, marking off names with deliberate precision. The sun climbed steadily overhead, warming the wooden boards beneath their boots. When he reached her entry, he paused for only a second before placing a small check beside it. "You will depart at 0600 tomorrow," he said, voice even. She nodded once. Yes. The space between them felt defined, steady as ever, yet carrying a new weight. Final paperwork was placed on the edge of the table. She stepped forward, retrieved it, and stepped back. Their hands did not meet. They did not need to. Around them, the yard continued its quiet rhythm. Crates shifted, fabric folded. A breeze moved lightly through the open field beyond the wire. Later that evening, as the sun lowered in wide bands of amber across the horizon, the selected women were allowed a few extra minutes in the yard. Aiko stood near the fence, looking outward across miles of open land she would soon leave behind. The compound had not been gentle, yet it had not stripped her of herself. That distinction mattered. Footsteps approached, measured and familiar. Ethan stopped a few yards away, not closing the distance. The sky behind him burned softly with color. "Safe travels," he said, not as a farewell heavy with sentiment, but as a simple truth offered plainly. She turned slightly toward him. "Thank you," she replied. The words were not elaborate. They did not need to be. The boundary remained intact between them, clear and respected to the end. As the last light faded and the yard fell into shadow, Aiko understood something with quiet certainty. She would leave at dawn. The fence would remain. The distance would remain. But the dignity restored within that measured space would travel with her, carried not in her hands, but in the way she now stood. Dawn arrived without ceremony. The sky over West Texas was still a deep shade of blue when the transport truck rolled through the outer gate at 5:45. Its headlights cut pale lines across the yard, briefly illuminating the fence, the watchtower, the wooden barracks that had framed so many quiet mornings. The air felt cool against Aiko's skin, almost sharp, carrying the faint scent of dust and open land. She stood with the other women selected for departure, a small canvas bag resting at her feet. The yard looked the same as it had on her first day. Flat ground, wide horizon, 6 feet of measured space. Private Ethan Walker stepped into position for the final roll call, clipboard in hand, hat brim low. The routine did not bend for farewell. Names were called one by one. Voices answered. When he spoke hers, the sound carried clearly in the still air. "Tanaka, Aiko." "Present," she replied. The word felt different this time. Not temporary. Not waiting. Present. He marked the page with deliberate care, then closed the clipboard. The engine of the truck idled softly beyond the fence line. The other guards moved with efficient quiet, checking lists, securing straps. No one rushed. No one lingered. Aiko lifted her bag and stepped forward with the group toward the gate. The gravel shifted beneath her boots. As she reached the familiar boundary in the yard, she paused for half a second. Ethan stood exactly where he always had, 6 feet away. The distance remained unbroken to the end. The sky behind him had begun to lighten, a thin band of gold spreading across the horizon. "Travel steady," he said, voice even. Not loud, not soft, just steady. She met his gaze fully this time. No flinch, No hesitation. Thank you, she answered. The words held weight, but no excess. He inclined his head once. No handshake followed. No crossing of space. The line remained intact, respected to its final inch. She turned and walked toward the waiting truck. The gate opened with a low metallic sound, then closed behind the departing group. As the vehicle pulled away, the compound receded slowly in the rear view. Fence posts grew smaller. The watchtower thinned into silhouette. The yard became a pale square against endless land. Aiko sat upright on the wooden bench inside the truck, hands resting calmly in her lap. The road stretched ahead in a straight line, bordered by dry grass that shimmered under the rising sun. She did not look back again. There was no need. The distance that had once separated guard and prisoner had never been bridged by touch. It had been bridged by restraint, by a man who understood that strength could stand still, and by a woman who learned that dignity, once protected, does not depend on walls or wire. As the sun cleared the horizon fully, light filled the cab of the truck in warm, even bands. The land opened wide before her. The fence remained behind, but the standard that had been quietly raised in 6 feet of space traveled forward with her, steady and unbroken.